It was an average day, a simple day, when I first laid eyes on her. I woke up that morning expecting the day to be the same as all the other days of my life. I woke up early, made coffee, read the morning paper, and headed out to the local park to enjoy a walk before work. As I walked along the trail, I was taken aback by how everything seemed to turn green overnight. I guess that's how spring worked. You wait and wait for it, and then all of a sudden, you wake up, and there it is. The air was warm, the grass was green, and the trees were starting to bud. I could smell the freshness of the earth as I rounded the corner to take to my favorite spot. It was a secluded little section surrounded by pine trees that hid a larger oak tree in the center of a small field. I had been coming here since I was a kid and had never seen anyone else stumble upon it. That was until that morning. As I walked into the field, I saw a young woman sitting at the base of the old oak tree. She was huddled over a notebook, scribbling furiously while talking to no one in particular. Stared at her for a moment, distracted by the way the spring breeze caught her long auburn hair and blew it away from her face. She was a slender, small woman, maybe no taller than 5'4". Her heart-shaped face seemed to harbor a look of love and contentment as she stared at her notebook. I saw her bite her lip and tap her pencil on her leg, a habit when she was concentrating, I assumed. I gently chuckled, and I watched her wave her hands above her head, stating a dialogue that I had never heard. After she said her piece, I saw her smile slightly and bring her pencil down to her notebook, writing the dialogue she had just said to the trees. Even as she was writing, she began talking again, adding more to her dialogue. Her voice had a sing-song quality to it that made me want to lie down in the grass and listen to her for hours. With the breeze lightly shaking the leaves on the trees, it seemed as if the tree was talking back in their own way. She didn't seem to hear me, so I cleared my throat, and I began walking towards her. Startled, she looked up at me with big blue eyes. I smiled as I approached her and said, "Do you make it a habit to talk to trees?" She smiled at me and, waving her arms to emphasize her point, stated, "Well, of course, they're really the best listeners." Her eyes shone with a type of light that I have yet to see in anyone else's eyes, even to this day, as her laughter echoed across the empty field. I smiled at her and asked her name. In her sweet sing-song voice, she replied, "Joanna." I'd like to say that I didn't fall in love with her right away. I'd like to say that our love developed over time, that as I began to get to know her, know who she truly was, that was when I knew I loved her. But it would be a lie. No, I fell in love with her in that moment. Of course, I never admitted it at the time, the strong man that I was. I instead just said that she was a girl I was seeing. Nothing serious, but it was anything but. On our first date, she showed up on my doorstep 10 minutes late, as I would soon find out was on time for her, in a baby blue dress that seemed to make the light in her eyes shine even brighter. She hugged me as soon as I opened the door and walked right in, just like she would for the years to come. I cooked her dinner that night, a simple meal of brown sugar glazed chicken with steamed broccoli and homemade rolls. She ate probably about as much as I did, which I found utterly impressive, and talked all night long. Talked about everything under the sun, her job, her family, her friends, her life. I watched as her face lit up with joy as she talked about her nephews, who were 3 and 7. I had never seen someone talk about their life with such gratefulness and contentment. She had everything she needed in life and was perfectly able to take care of herself. That fact intimidated and intrigued me all at the same time. Maybe it was because of that fact why I wanted her in my life, because she didn't need me. But I certainly needed her. It didn't take us long to know that we wanted to spend the rest of our lives with each other. For me, it happened one night as I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, listening to her hum softly as she washed the dishes from our dinner. She seemed to sense my presence and turned around, soap bubbles scattered in her hair and a smile on her face. I smiled at her while I walked around the kitchen table over to her and wrapped my arms around her waist. Her eyes sparkled at me, like she knew that we would be doing this for the rest of our lives, and kissed me gently. I proposed to her a few months later, in the park where I had first laid eyes on her. She gladly said yes, and we started to plan our life together. We saw no need for a long engagement. A few months was perfect for us. So, on a crisp October morning, we stood in front of our family and friends in a beautiful church where she had grown up. and pledged our love to each other. I can remember, even after all these years, the way tears welled up in her still bright eyes as I said, I promise to take every day as it comes. I promise to plan for our future while living in the present. I promise to take care of you for the rest of our lives and to love you even when you're being unlovable. But more importantly, I promise to never leave you and that I will always be by your side, no matter what life throws at us. We left the church that day happier than we could have ever imagined. After a couple months in my cramped apartment, we decided to begin searching for a house to make into our home. Joanna, determined to find our perfect home, had an extensive screening process. She would look at the house itself, and by look, I mean scour every single detail of the house. No spot on that house remained unseen by my lovely wife. Then, if the house passed the test, it was on to talking to the neighbors, checking the school districts, and a plethora of other tests the home had to pass before we could call it our own. Somehow, and to this day, I'm not sure how, we found a home that passed all of Joanna's tests. We quickly moved into the house and, following the normal routine of a married couple, adopted a dog from the local animal shelter. Started our own little family and loved every minute of it. We would take our dog for a walk every morning before work and spent our Saturday mornings eating breakfast in bed. As the years passed, as happy as our life was, Joanna began to want a little more. Every time a baby commercial came on, she looked at me and would say, "We could use a little bundle of joy around here." After a couple months of her baby eyes, I agreed that it would be nice to add a little boy or girl to our family. Unfortunately, that's not what life had in store for us. Once we realized that something was wrong, we went to the doctors and underwent countless hours of testing. A couple weeks after the journey began, we received a call saying that we needed to come into the office. Gripping each other's hands, we sat in the doctor's office as they told us we were unable to have children. As I looked over at my wife, I felt my heart break. Although it felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, the pain this caused her was more than she could bear. It was more than I could help her with. I watched as the color drained from her face, felt her cold fingers tighten around my hand, and the beautiful light I had come to love left her eyes. She nodded and listened patiently as the doctor talked about our other options, but I could see that she wasn't all there. And in the months that followed, I could tell a part of her was gone, maybe forever. I watched as she woke up every morning, put a smile on her face, and went out into the world as if a part of her wasn't dead inside. No matter what I did, no matter what anyone did, she always said she was fine, just fine. It wasn't until one Sunday morning when I woke up to the smell of something burning where she finally let me know how she was really feeling. I walked out of our bedroom into our small yellow kitchen and saw charcoal black muffins sitting on the counter, smoke surrounding the air around them. Joanna was sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to her chest, sobbing. I immediately went over to her and put my arms around her. I didn't say anything. That's not what she needed. Right now, she just needed me there. After a couple moments, she looked at me and said, "I'm just so sad." I held her closer and stroked her feather-soft hair, murmuring that everything would be okay. Amazingly, this seemed to be a turning point for her. After that morning, she slowly started to act more and more like her happy, loving self. With each day that passed, I saw the light return to her beautiful blue eyes. Now, without the option of children, our long-term plans changed drastically. We decided to make the most of the situation, and I took a job overseas in France working for an international magazine. Joanna and I sold our house, packed up our belongings, and spent the next 40 years traveling for my assignments. We both enjoyed being able to live in our other cultures and get a glimpse of what life was like outside of America. We spent years walking down the cobblestone streets in Italy, hiking the Andes Mountains in South America, and drinking in the pubs of Ireland. We absorbed the cultures, and the beauty that only comes with traveling seeped into both of our writings. The magazine I worked for loved my writing and ended up promoting me through the ranks over the years. And not only that, but Joanna also wrote 5 beautiful novels over the years that were published around the world. We both loved our life. In fact, it was more wonderful than we could have ever imagined. One night, as we were eating in the terrace of our temporary apartment in Belize, I looked at my wife and was taken aback by the woman I married so many years ago. Yes, she had changed. Her hair had turned gray, lines had formed around her eyes and mouth, and wisdom shone in her still blue eyes. She had transformed from the young, vibrant girl I fell in love with into a warm, sophisticated woman who, if it's even possible, I was even more in love with. As I looked into those eyes that were bright enough to forever brighten my world, I couldn't imagine a point in my life where she wasn't around, where she wasn't her. She was my personal sunshine, always encouraging me to grow into the person she knew I could be. I smiled at her as I took her delicate hand in my own, both worn from age, and gently brushed my lips against hers. I would have liked to say that we lived the rest of our lives in perfect peace and happiness, but once again, life had something else in store for us. It started small. She would leave the groceries in the car after she came home from shopping, forget where she put her keys, or where we had made dinner reservations for that night. We didn't think anything of it at first and just chalked up her loss of memory to old age, as most people do in this situation. It wasn't until a Sunday morning, when I was awoken by the smell of burnt food, that we realized something was seriously wrong. I got out of bed, walked into the kitchen, and saw charcoal black muffins sitting on the counter, smoke surrounding the air around them. Joanna was sitting at the dining room table, head in her hands, crying. I immediately went over to her and put my arms around her. I didn't say anything. That's not what she needed. Right now, she just needed me there. After a while, she pulled away from my embrace and looked into my eyes. My heart broke as I watched her tears fall as she whispered, "I'm just so scared." Found out later that she had forgotten that she was fixing me breakfast, that she had gotten up, started the muffins, and then completely forgotten. That day, we packed up our things and moved back to the States. As soon as we had settled in, we went to the doctors, and Joanna underwent hours of testing. It didn't take long before we received a call saying that we needed to come into the office. Gripping each other's hands, we sat in the doctor's office as they told us that Joanna had Alzheimer's. As I looked over at my wife, I felt my heart break and my stomach drop to the floor. She was my world. She had always been the one constant I had in this life. As I felt my world crumbling, I was reminded that this wasn't about me. I saw the pain of the news wash across my wife's face. I watched as her color drained, felt her cold fingers tighten around my hand, and I watched as the beautiful light in her eyes faded into dull, flat blue eyes. She nodded and listened patiently as the doctor talked about our other options, but I could see that she wasn't all there. We went home that day completely different people. Joanna went into planning mode. She began making lists to remind her of everything she had to do, whether it was when to make dinner or what to make for dinner or what to clean. She wrote it all down. As her memory continued to slip, she decided that she wanted to move into a home so I wouldn't have to deal with her memory loss. When she first told me this, I flat out refused. I tried to explain to her that I didn't want her to leave, that all I wanted with the rest of my life was her, no matter what condition she believed herself to be in. Still, she wouldn't budge. She began her famous home screening process and searched for a place to call her new home. She was determined to get her way on this one, but I also was determined to make her stay. So I took her on a little field trip back to the church where we were married. I walked with her down the aisle, and when we were standing at the front of the church, in the same places we had stood 40-some years before, I looked into her eyes and repeated the words I had said on our wedding day. I promise to take every day as it comes. I promise to plan for our future while living in the present. I promise to take care of you for the rest of our lives and to love you even when you're being unlovable. But more importantly, I promise to never leave you and that I will always be by your side, no matter what life throws at us. Tears filled her eyes as she leaned in to kiss me softly. She stopped fighting, and we continued to live together for a couple more years until we both knew that it was time for her to move to a facility that would help her more than I could. The day she was set to move in, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, listening to her hum softly as she washed the dishes from our breakfast. She seemed to sense my presence and turned around, soap bubbles scattered in her gray-streaked hair. She was surprisingly coherent on that morning, so she smiled at me, actually recognizing who I was. I walked around the kitchen table over to her and wrapped my arms around her waist. She looked into my eyes, and knowing that this would be the last time we would be able to enjoy a morning together, I saw her smile begin to fade as she kissed me gently. Even after she moved into her new home, I still went every day to visit her. Some days she would remember who I was, while others she just thought I was a nurse there to help her walk around the grounds. Although it hurt looking into her eyes and knowing that she didn't remember the life we had built together, it was still wonderful to sit down and have a meal with my wife. We would talk about everything under the sun, her job, her family, her friends, her life. I watched once again as her face lit up with joy as she talked about her nephews, whose ages varied depending on where her memory was that day. I still saw the same woman I fell in love with so many years ago. She talked about her life with such gratefulness and contentment. In her mind, she had everything she needed in life and was perfectly able to take care of herself. That fact made me smile long after I had left her to go back to my own home for the night. One morning, I woke up to a call from the home saying that Joanna had gotten out earlier that morning and they couldn't find her. Panicked, I put my jacket on over my pajamas and slipped into my shoes. I got in my car and began driving around town, searching for any sign of my Joanna. As I was about to give up and head back to Joanna's home, I saw a park off in the distance. Once I was at the park, I pulled into the parking lot, climbed out of the car, and smiled. If she was here, which I had a strong inclination that she was, I knew exactly where she would be. I began hobbling along the trail I knew so well. I could smell the freshness of the earth as I rounded the corner to take to my favorite spot. Our favorite. It was a secluded little section, surrounded by pine trees that hid a larger oak in the center of a small field. As I walked into the field, I saw a woman sitting at the base of the old oak tree. She was huddled over a notebook, scribbling furiously while talking to no one in particular. I stared at her for a moment, distracted by the way the spring breeze caught her long gray hair and blew it away from her face. She was a frail, older woman, maybe no taller than 5'4". Her heart-shaped face seemed to harbor a look of love, contentment, and wisdom as she stared down at her notebook. I saw her bite her lip and tap her pencil on her leg, a habit of hers when she was concentrating, I knew. I gently chuckled as I watched her wave her hands over her head, stating a dialogue that I heard so many years ago. After she said her piece, I saw her smile slightly and bring her pencil down to her notebook, writing the dialogue she had just said to the trees. Even as she was writing, she began talking again, adding more to her dialogue. Her voice still had that sing-song quality to it that made me want to lie down in the grass and listen to her for hours. With the breeze lightly shaking the leaves on the trees, it seemed as if the tree was talking back in their own way. She didn't seem to hear me, so I cleared my throat and began walking towards her. Startled, she looked up at me with big blue eyes. I smiled as I approached her and said, "Do you make it a habit to talk to trees?" She smiled at me and, waving her arms to emphasize her point, stated, "Of course, I've come to find they make the best listeners." Her eyes shone once again with the light that had been gone from them for so long as her laughter echoed across the empty field. I smiled at her, feeling my heart soar as I took in the sight of her, and asked her name. In her sweet, sing-song voice, she replied, "Joanna."